New York, the city the whole world knows today, a city of dreams, money, and skyscrapers. But before the towers scraped the clouds, before America as we know it was born, Manhattan was hell itself. A city reeking of blood, sweat, and rotting corpses. A city where poverty bred rage, and rage bred violence. A city built by immigrants nobody wanted. This isn't a story about dreams. This is a story about fighting for the right to exist. About how a metropolis rises from mud, hunger, and street blood. You'll learn who really ruled New York before the skyscrapers appeared. Who the people were who created the gangs before anyone even called them the mob. And how immigrants transformed the bottom of society into America's foundation. Before we travel back in time, leave a thumbs up if you love the histories nobody talks about anymore. Drop a comment. Have you ever heard of the real gangs of New York? Ready? Let's begin. You're standing on deck. The wind from the Atlantic carries the smell of salt and hope. Behind you, 2 months in the stinking belly of a ship, where you shared space with 100 other wretches just like you. Ahead, New York. The year 1848. The ocean was like a living beast for those 8 weeks. Waves hammered the hull higher than the masts. People prayed aloud, shouting verses they remembered from childhood. Some whispered prayers quietly. Others stopped altogether. In the hold, it was dark. Not dark like night. Dark like a grave. A candle cost more than we could pay. We lay on bare boards, waiting for the ship to stop pitching. It never did. Someone beside you vomits over the rail. For the last time today, his wife tries to hold him up, but she can barely stand herself. A child cries. Someone's always crying on these boats. You remember the first week at sea. A woman in the corner of the hold stopped breathing in the night. Nobody noticed until morning. She lay there half a day before the crew took her away. They wrapped her in cheap cloth and threw her overboard. Without a word, a splash and silence. A week later, typhus. The fever spread like wildfire. People shook despite the heat. They were delirious. They screamed the names of relatives who died long ago in Ireland. 1,000 other people on this ship. 750 made it to New York. The rest, the ocean. And then you see it, Manhattan, the promised island, the city that's supposed to change everything. A silhouette on the horizon. Buildings that seem to touch the sky, though the tallest are barely 5 stories. Ports full of masts. Smoke from hundreds of chimneys creating a gray haze over the city. Mother used to say, America is a place where everyone can start over. Where the land doesn't devour your family with hunger. Where there are no English landlords charging rent for the mud you're trying to grow something on. You look at Manhattan and want to believe it. You must believe it. Because otherwise, why did you come here? The ship docks. The process is slow, painful. It stretches for hours. People crammed on deck, everyone trying to see anything. A mother holds her child above her head. Look, son, this is your new home. The child cries, doesn't understand. But someday he will. You walk down from the deck. Your legs barely remember how to walk on something that doesn't sway. You plan to take a step. The floor doesn't drop beneath you. Strange feeling. Almost disappointing. Someone shouts in English. You don't understand the words, but the tone is clear. Move. Keep going. Don't stand there. Officials in uniforms check documents. Most people don't have documents. They ask for name, place of birth. They write something in large books. Next. Your first breath on American soil. It stinks. Horse manure, rotten fish, factory smoke. The sweat of thousands of people crammed into one place. And then the truth hits you. You didn't arrive in paradise. You arrived in a city that feeds on people. But at least you don't smell that sharp scent of death that filled the room when your younger brother stopped breathing that cold March. This is a different stench. The stench of life, not death. You walk on. The crowd parts and closes like a wave. Faces sweaty, pale, foreign. People scream in languages you've never heard before. German, Italian, maybe Czech or Russian. Everything blurs into a cacophony of voices where the meaning of words is lost. Someone tries to sell you something. You don't know what, but you shake your head. You have no money. You have exactly $2.80. $2.80. That's how much your hope is worth now. Merchants surround the newly arrived like vultures. Room for rent. Cheap room. Work for strong hands. Citizenship in a week. Their voices cut the air like blades. All of it sounds like promises made from dirt and lies. And then you hear it for the first time. Go back where you came from, dirty Irishman. You turn around. 3 men, elegant hats, clean shoes, smooth-shaven faces. They look at you like garbage washed up by the sea. No Irish needed, one says and spits in your direction. Doesn't hit you, but it doesn't matter. The third laughs mockingly. Another papist. The whole city reeks of them. That word, papist, you hear it for the first time. Protestants use it with contempt toward Catholics. In their mouths, it's not a description of faith, it's an insult, a sentence, a sign that you're someone who can be humiliated without consequence. You stand there with a bundle containing your entire life. Your father's old coat, worn through with holes, but still keeps you warm. Your mother's rosary, the only keepsake of her, still smelling of smoke from the family cottage. Half a loaf of stale bread, a shirt with more holes than fabric, and that same pain in your chest you've carried since the day you left behind the green hills, home, and your family's graves. Suddenly you understand. Here too you'll fight, just for something different. Not for land, not for food, for dignity, for the right to exist, for the ability to breathe without feeling guilty. Behind you, you hear bells from St. Peter's Church. Their sound mixes with screams, neighing horses, crying children, and the clatter of wheels on cobblestones. The city pulses, lives, breathes heavily, like someone sick who refuses to die. You look at rows of chimneys belching smoke so thick it obscures the sky. This isn't Dublin. This isn't London. This is New York, a city being born in pain. This isn't a story about gangs, though it will be about them too. This isn't a story about violence, though there'll be so much violence your eyes will ache. This is a story about how a city grows up, how it rises from mud, blood, and bricks, how streets become battlefields for identity, and people pushed to the bottom become the foundation of its power. This is the story of New York, the city built by those nobody wanted, the city that spit in their faces, and they stayed anyway, because they had nowhere else to go. To understand why we're here, you need to go back 3 years, to 1845, to land that stopped producing, Ireland. My father grew potatoes on a piece of land that wasn't ours, never was. We rented it from an English landlord who maybe visited once in his life. We paid rent in grain and tubers. What remained was enough to survive, barely. And then the blight came. They called it late potato blight. Sounds innocent, doesn't it? Like something you can wash off your hands. But you can't. You wake up in the morning, go to the field, and what yesterday was green and full of life, today is black. Leaves rotting, stalks crumbling, the earth stinking like an open grave. One day was enough for everything we lived on to vanish. Father dug potatoes from the ground desperately. Maybe underneath there are still good ones? There weren't. black mass fell apart in his hands. Mother tried to cook them. The water turned brown, and the taste was poison. Little Seamus died first. He was 5. He stopped eating because there was nothing to eat. Then he stopped talking. Then he stopped moving. He lay in the corner of the cottage and stared at the ceiling. One morning, his eyes didn't open. There was nothing to bury him with. Father wrapped him in his own shirt. That's all we had. A year later, Mother died. A year after her, my sister. Father survived the longest, but he was already just a shadow. When he died, he weighed barely 80 pounds. Before the hunger, he'd weighed 160, 500,000 people. That many didn't make it to the end of the 40s, not from the blight, from hunger, in a country that exported food to England. Because you see, the potatoes died, but wheat grew, oats too, just not for us. The landlord needed his rent. England needed its bread. We could just die. And we died. Or we fled. Ships sailed from Ireland every week. They called them coffin ships. Half the passengers never reached shore. You paid everything you had for a place in the hold. Not a cabin, the hold, between crates and rats. You slept on bare boards. You ate what you brought. And when the food ran out, you were on your own. I was lucky. I survived. I reached New York in 1848 with 10 others from my village. 40 of us left. We thought, it's over. We made it. Now it'll be better. We were as naive as children. New York in the mid-19th century was a city of contrasts, as brutal as a punch in the face. In northern Manhattan, elegant residences of merchants, politicians, and bankers. Paved streets, clean parks, women smelling of perfume. And down below, chaos, filth, hell. That's where we ended up. In neighborhoods where streets stank of urine and horse manure, where the contents of chamber pots flew from windows straight onto the heads of passers-by, where children ran barefoot through mud mixed with garbage. 5 points. The intersection of 5 streets on filled-in swampland. A place even the police avoided after dark. But we'll get to that. First, welcome to America. No Irish need apply. You saw that sign in every third storefront. They were looking for workers, but not us. Looking for servants, but not our wives. Looking for anyone, as long as they weren't Catholics with accents. Protestants hated us. Or rather, they feared us. Feared we'd take their jobs, that we'd lower wages, that our papist superstitions would destroy their Protestant order. In newspapers, they drew us like apes. Literally, an Irishman in a caricature wasn't human. He was an ape-like monster with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a revolver in the other. In 1831, a Protestant mob burned down St. Mary's Catholic Church in Manhattan. They just showed up at night with torches. Nobody was arrested. 13 years later, in Philadelphia, they burned 2 more churches. 13 people died. We knew we could be next. But the worst wasn't what they did. The worst was what they said. Abraham Lincoln, the same man who abolished slavery, wrote in 1855 a letter warning that if the movement of hatred toward foreigners won, the Declaration of Independence would read, "All men are created equal, except for Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics." You understand? Even he saw where this was heading. And us? We tried to survive. Men worked at the docks, unloading ships, digging ditches, building canals. The worst, dirtiest, lowest paid jobs. 12 hours a day for a bowl of soup and $1. Women went as servants to wealthy homes or to textile factories where it was hot as an oven. Children? Children worked wherever they were allowed. Or they stole. Because otherwise, you don't survive. We all knew we were tolerated. not accepted. They needed our hands, but not our faces. Organizations emerged, secret societies of white Protestants who wanted to defend America from the Catholic invasion. The Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Their motto, America for Americans. But who were these Americans? White Protestants born here. Everyone else was an intruder. They swore oaths they wouldn't allow Catholics into power and wouldn't permit immigrants any public office. When someone asked for details, they answered, "I know nothing." And so began the Know Nothing Party. Sounds funny? In the 1850s, they had their mayors, their senators, and a former president at the helm. We knew we were at war, not with an army, with an ideology. But we weren't innocent lambs either. In 5 Points, where Irish immigrants lived, our own structures were born. Mutual aid societies, sports clubs, volunteer fire companies, and gangs. Because if the city hates you, you have to find family elsewhere. And if nobody will defend you, you have to learn to fight yourself. Dead Rabbits, Bowery Boys, 40 Thieves, Plug Uglies. Names that would soon become legends or nightmares, depending on which side of the street you stood. But first, the place where it all began. 5 Points. Hell on earth. Every city has its bottom. New York had 5 Points. Imagine a place where the earth literally stinks, where houses stand on filled swamps that still release gases, where sewage is a concept known from stories, but nobody here has seen it. 5 Points arose on the site of a former pond called Collect Pond. Once it was a beautiful place. People fished there, swam, spent summer afternoons. Decades earlier, however, the city decided the pond took up too much space. They filled it with rubble, earth, and garbage. Nobody thought the swamp underneath wouldn't disappear. So they built houses, cheap, quick, from any old wood. After a few years, they started sinking. Walls cracked, foundations sank into the mire. People needed a place to live. Landlords needed rent money, so they kept renting. 10, 15, sometimes 20 people in one room. You enter such a building, and the smell hits you immediately. A mixture of sweat, urine, boiled cabbage, and something you don't want to recognize. The stairs creak under your feet. From above, you hear arguments in foreign languages. From below, the cry of a child woken before dawn by hunger. Your room is maybe 100 square feet for 8 people. One window, facing a courtyard as narrow as a mine shaft. Instead of light, it lets in the stench from other apartments. Water? One pump for 3 buildings. A line from dawn, and often brown liquid flows anyway. Toilet, at best, a hole in the floor at the end of the corridor. At worst, a chamber pot emptied in the morning into a communal pit. In winter, you sleep in your clothes, with ice on your eyelashes. In summer, sweat runs down the walls, and the air thickens with stench and mosquitoes. And rats everywhere, big as cats, brazen as people. I saw a rat take bread from under a sleeping child's hand. I saw a mother chase a rodent with a stick, screaming, because it was their last piece of food that day. A few years before we arrived in the city, a certain English writer visited, Charles Dickens. He visited 5 Points and later wrote that pigs run everywhere, and only God knows why their masters walk on 2 legs instead of 4. For him, it was an anecdote. For us, everyday life. 5 Points wasn't just houses, it was a whole living organism. On the ground floors, grocery stores, pawn shops, stalls with clothing and tools, and next to them hundreds of cheap saloons. Beer, whiskey, gambling, and women in rooms above the hall. You pass through Paradise Square, the district's main plaza. The name ironic as hell. By day trade, by night brawls. Screams heard until morning, and police only appeared in groups, with clubs ready, At the heart of this district stood a tenement that became legendary, the Old Brewery. Once they actually brewed beer there. Later, the building was converted into a poorhouse. Over 1,000 people supposedly lived there. They said someone died there every night for over a decade. I don't know if that's true, but I know the police didn't enter without backup. A friend who lived there repeated that the worst were the nights. Screams, smashing, crying, and sometimes laughter so empty it was cold. In the morning, they carried out bodies. Nobody asked who they were. Another corpse from 5 Points. Diseases were everywhere. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, diphtheria. In this district, you lived an entire generation shorter than in the wealthier part of Manhattan. Children died before they learned to talk. I remember a neighbor who buried 3 of hers in a week. The illness came midweek. By Sunday, she had 3 graves. She couldn't afford coffins. She wrapped the bodies in shirts. The priest said a brief prayer, not for free, for a bottle of whiskey. The next day, the woman returned to work because rent doesn't pay itself. The press wrote about us like a plague. Newspapers screamed, Catholic immigrants spread disease and crime. Not one wrote that maybe it wasn't the people, but the lack of sewage, lack of clean water, and lack of hope. In the papers, it was easier to blame the poor than admit the city was rotting from the inside. And people believed it, because it's easier to believe the Irish are inferior. Yet 5 Points wasn't only misery. There was also solidarity. In this district, neighbor understood neighbor. When you couldn't pay rent, someone slipped you a few cents. When you got sick, a neighbor brought soup. We created associations that collected money for funerals, for building a church, for defense when someone was arrested. Dead Rabbits, Bowery Boys, 40 Thieves, Plug Uglies, names meant to inspire fear. In some, they inspired hope. In others, hatred. 5 Points was hell, but also refuge. A place where people learned to live with hunger, filth, and anger. And a place where a new force was born. Because there, in the mud and stench, gangs were born that would soon set the rhythm for the entire city. The first gang in 5 Points wasn't yet called Dead Rabbits. They were known as the 40 Thieves. They arose shortly after New York stopped being a merchant port and became a labyrinth of poverty. A band of young Irishmen who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They stole because they had no other choice. At first, small things. Wallets, watches, handkerchiefs. They operated in crowds, at markets, in saloons full of drunk sailors. The founder was one Edward Coleman, a handsome, well-dressed cut-purse who tried to combine crime with elegance. He had a code, a system. Every member had to acquire loot worth at least $2 daily. Anyone who didn't meet the quota was out. They trained the younger ones, creating something like a school for thieves, 40 Little Thieves. Kids 10, 12 years old learned how to lift purses, how to disappear into crowds before the victim noticed missing money. It was a survival academy, and for many, the only school they'd ever have. But the world in 5 Points changed quickly. A few years later, a new group appeared, Dead Rabbits. The name sounded absurd, but had its legend. During one meeting of Irish thugs, someone threw a dead rabbit on the table. For some, it was a bad omen. For others, a sign. The latter broke away and founded their own gang. The symbol became a rabbit impaled on a pike, a banner of flesh and blood. They carried it in marches, in brawls, in battles. It was meant to remind them that each of them was already dead in the city's eyes. Dead Rabbits weren't petty thieves. This was an organized street army. At their peak, they numbered several hundred men, young Irishmen between 15 and 25, armed with clubs, bricks, knives. They rushed to battle for every foot of 5 Points. On the other side of the street stood their enemies, the Bowery Boys. Boys from the Bowery. That was a different story. Not immigrants, but native New Yorkers, white Protestants, real Americans. Their neighborhood was poor, but more orderly. They worked as printers, mechanics, porters. Many belonged to the fire department, volunteer but organized like a brotherhood. At that time, firefighting wasn't a city service, but a business. Whoever arrived first got paid by the building's owner. Fire companies rivaled each other, sometimes fought in the middle of fires. The Bowery Boys controlled several such units. They had red firemen's shirts, tall top hats, and trousers tucked into boots. They looked like gentlemen until they pulled out their clubs. They said about themselves, "We're not a gang. We're defending the city." But they only defended the city against one thing: people like us. They were part of the nativist movement, supported the Know Nothing Party, whose slogan was, "America for Americans." In practice, it meant 0 Catholics, 0 immigrants, 0 Irish. Before elections, Bowery Boys manned polling places. They stood in doorways with clubs. When an Irish worker tried to vote, he got hit in the head. Police? Silent. Many officers came from the same streets as the nativists. The first clashes were small, a brawl in a saloon, an argument on a corner. One hit, another responded. After 5 minutes, 20 men had sticks and bricks in their hands. But over time, brawls turned into wars. It was about territory. Dead Rabbits controlled 5 Points. The Bowery belonged to Bowery Boys. And between them was a strip of no man's land, a few streets, a few blocks where daily battle raged. Because territory meant control over business, saloons, prostitution, gambling, trade in stolen goods, and business meant power. The fights had nothing to do with film romance. 20 people against 20. Firearms were rare, too expensive. They used clubs, boards, bricks, knives. Someone screamed, someone threw the first stone, and then hell began. A brick in the skull, blood on hands, the crack of bones. You fall, you get up, or you don't. After a few minutes, silence. Police arrived when it was already over. In the next day's paper, riots in 5 Points. No names, no details. Another day in hell. But this wasn't just a man's war. Among the fighters were also women. Hellcat Maggie, a real Irish woman, member of Dead Rabbits. She filed her teeth sharp, wore brass fittings on her fingers that worked like claws. In brawls, she threw herself at opponents and tore their faces with her claws. She bit off ears. The press wrote about her with terror. Demon woman from 5 Points. There was also Gallus Mag, a tall, strong woman, bar owner. When a customer made trouble, she grabbed him by the ear and dragged him outside. Literally, by the ear. When he resisted, she bit it off and kept it in a jar of alcohol. The collection sat on a shelf behind the bar. In this chaos were also politicians. Gangs weren't just bands anymore. They became tools of power. The Democratic machine Tammany Hall knew immigrants meant votes. Thousands of votes. The party leader, William Boss Tweed, distributed jobs, food packages, organized citizenship. In return, vote for us, and make sure others vote too. Dead Rabbits kept order at elections, intimidated opponents, stuffed ballot boxes with fake cards, beat those who dared vote for the wrong side. Bowery Boys did the same, just for the nativists. Democracy? Back then it was war, and the streets were the front, and everyone knew about it. Newspapers wrote about gangs, police knew their names, politicians drank with them in the same saloons. But nobody did anything, because the system worked. Dirty, bloody, but it worked. until the 4th day of July, 1857 arrived. Independence Day. The day New York saw it was splitting into two armies. The 4th of July was supposed to be a day of celebration, fireworks, music, laughter in the streets. But in 1857, this day turned into a bloody battle. For weeks, tension had been building like in a powder keg. Dead rabbits and Bowery boys clashed almost daily. Small brawls, brief skirmishes, broken windows, smashed heads. Police, or rather two police forces, municipal, loyal to the mayor supporting immigrants, and metropolitan, new, appointed by state authorities standing with the nativists. Both wore uniforms. Both considered themselves legitimate, and both hated each other mortally. A few weeks earlier, there was even an open battle between them. Police officers fought police officers under City Hall itself. The sight was grotesque, the law fighting itself. Gangsters just laughed. Because they knew one thing. Now, nobody would stop them. On the evening of July 4th, dead rabbits marched from Paradise Square. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This was a war march. Maybe 1,000 gathered. Dead rabbits, roach guards, some from Plug Uglies, visitors from the ports, armed with clubs, poles, bricks, pistols that barely worked. At the front, they carried the symbol, a dead rabbit impaled on a pike. People hid in houses. Mothers closed shutters. Children cried in doorways. Everyone knew that tonight, New York would stop sleeping. The column passed through 5 points and reached the Bowery, the heart of the Protestant district. There, in one of the largest saloons, Bowery boys gathered. The cry, "At them!" And the first stones flew. Then bricks. Windows shattered. Doors flew off hinges. They burst from the building in red firefighter shirts, with top hats on heads and clubs in hands. They plunged into the crowd like enraged dogs. This wasn't a brawl. This was a battle. The street rumbled with footsteps and screams. Bricks whistled, wood cracked, clubs fell on heads. They fought drunk, bloody, without mercy. Blood mixed with mud. Someone screamed in Irish, someone in English, someone just roared. Fire started when someone knocked over a barrel of kerosene. Flames illuminated the cobblestones and men beating each other like animals in a cage. Police watched. Municipal at Metropolitan. Metropolitan at Municipal. Neither wanted to move. The city burned, and they argued about jurisdiction. The fighting lasted all night. Dead rabbits built barricades from wagons, furniture, stones. They occupied the intersection of Bayard and Baxter. Bowery boys brought reinforcements. Their fire companies arrived with pumps, not for extinguishing fires, but for breaking barricades. Water shot from nozzles with such force it knocked people down. From rooftops, the rabbits threw bricks and bottles. From doorways, shots rang out. Someone took a bullet in the gut and fell. His comrades carried him to an alley, but he didn't survive an hour. By noon the next day, the barricades still stood. Then, the city finally reacted. Commissioner Simeon Draper, new chief of the Metropolitan Police, arrived with a detachment of 100 officers. They formed ranks and moved forward. The fight with gangsters was brutal. Police stormed stairwells, threw fighters from roofs, pulled the wounded from houses. Blood ran downstairs like a gutter. Finally, the barricades fell. The city fell silent. On the ground remained the wounded and dead. The next day, newspapers wrote about it like a war. Stones and clubs flew thickly. The wounded lay on sidewalks and were trampled. Dead rabbits advanced, pushing opponents up Bayard Street. Reinforced Bowery boys threw them back to Mulberry and Baxter, reported the New York Times. Officially, 8 people died, 30 to 100 wounded. Unofficially, nobody knows. Many wounded were taken home. Many died later. Some were never reported. One of the rabbits, who shot 3 opponents from behind the barricade, was caught by Bowery boys. They beat him to death in the middle of the street. Police watched. After the riots, 5 Points looked like after a battle. Burned wagons, broken windows, streets red with blood. On the threshold of Old Brewery sat a woman with a child on her lap. Dead. The child lived. It watched as men passed by and didn't stop even for a moment. Funerals were held quietly. Bodies buried at night, without names, in mass graves at the paupers' cemetery. Priests prayed briefly, without mass. Coffins were replaced by shirts and flour sacks. Mothers stood nearby, holding rosaries and bottles of whiskey, the only payment for prayer. For several days, silence reigned in the city. Only smoke rose above the rooftops. In newspapers, they wrote that New York had descended into hell. "Is this still America or already a jungle?" asked one columnist. The effects were immediate. The middle class, until then indifferent, began to fear. Politicians, journalists, and clergy demanded changes. They merged both police forces into one. They increased funds, numbers of officers, created central command. But the biggest change concerned the city itself. For the first time, New York saw that gangs weren't the street, they were the system. That violence isn't born in dark alleys, but in the decisions of people who rule from behind desks. Dead rabbits never regained their strength. Some leaders went to prison, some died. The rest dissolved into shadow. Bowery boys lasted a bit longer, but they too eventually vanished from the streets. A new era was coming. The era of Tammany Hall, of bosses and politicians who learned that violence is just another form of power. Because if you can't beat gangsters, you just hire them. William McGeer Tweed, Boss Tweed, the most corrupt politician in New York history, and my savior, because that's how it worked. Tweed didn't look like a gangster. He was obese, bald, wore elegant suits, diamond cufflinks, and always had a broad smile. He shook hands like an old friend. But this man stole over $70 million from the city treasury. Today, that would be $500 million. How did he do it? Simple. He controlled everything. Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine, had existed since the 30s, but only under Tweed did it transform into an empire. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. Immigrants arrived in the city, Irish, Germans, Italians, tired, dirty, broke, without language. They didn't know where to go, how to find a roof over their heads, how to get papers. And on the dock, Tweed's people waited. They greeted them like family. "Welcome to America, friend. Need help?" And they helped. They found a room, of course, in a tenement belonging to their people. They found work with a businessman who paid them a percentage for each worker. They arranged citizenship, lightning fast, no lines, no checking. And in return, just one thing, friend. When elections come, remember who helped you. And we remembered, because without Tammany, we'd be nobody. They gave us a roof over our heads, bread, and protection from nativists. They stood by our side when nobody else would even shake our hand. We thought it was gratitude. We didn't understand it was an investment. Tweed controlled everything: the city council, courts, police, fire department. Want a contract to build a bridge? Pay. Want a license for a bar? Pay. Want police to turn a blind eye to your business? Pay. And everyone paid, because the alternative was disappearing from the market. Money flowed like a river. Tweed and his people lived like kings, lavish estates, yachts, silver dishes, horses in stables. Everyone knew about it, but nobody protested. because even if we only got scraps, they were still better than hunger. And gangs? They were part of this machine. Tweed needed people for dirty work, someone to intimidate opponents, guard polling places, stuff ballot boxes with fake votes. Dead rabbits were ideal. In return, they had peace from police, their own territories, legal businesses on paper, and cash in their pockets. Before elections, Tammany organized mobilization. Gangs went through Irish neighborhoods and reminded people who their true friend was. And if someone forgot, they reminded them more effectively. On election day, they manned the polls. When an immigrant came, they led him straight to the ballot box and whispered who to vote for. When someone from another district came, "Elections are over, friend. Come back tomorrow." There was also the practice of repeaters. People voted several, sometimes a dozen times, in different disguises. In a wig, in a different coat, with a new name. Police watched and pretended not to see, because they were also on Tweed's payroll. On the other side of the barricade stood the Know-Nothings, the Nativist Party. Their goal was to throw us out of America, out of administration, off the streets, out of life. They claimed they were protecting the country from papists and foreigners. Their symbol was an eagle, their weapon, hatred. In the middle of the century, one of their men, James Harper, became mayor of New York. His first decision was to ban employing in offices anyone born outside the United States. Thousands of Irish lost jobs overnight. Guards, janitors, cleaners, fired. Know-Nothings organized parades. Hundreds of white Protestants marched through streets with banners, "America for Americans." They burned effigies of the Pope, shouted hymns about purity of blood and faith. We watched from windows, clenched our fists, but we couldn't do anything. Then we understood that Tammany wasn't just thieves. They were our defenders, and Tweed knew how to exploit it. By mid-century, Irish made up a third of New York's residents. Millions of votes, millions of pockets, millions of opportunities. Tweed gave us citizenship, sometimes legally, more often through false documents. But who cared? Most important, we could vote. And we voted. Again and again. Every election they won. Every one. Tammany Hall grew in power. Tweed had power greater than the governor and money greater than banks. He was a king without a crown. New York belonged to him. Until finally came the day when the empire began to crack. Newspapers that had been silent began to speak. The New York Times revealed the city's account books. Satirist Thomas Nast began publishing caricatures of Tweed, a fat thief in a suit with a bag of money instead of a head. Every drawing was like a punch in the gut. Eventually, even his people began to turn away. Tweed was arrested. The trial was a farce, but they convicted him. He fled to Spain, but there he was recognized by his face from Nast's caricatures. They brought him back to America. He died in prison a few years later, alone and forgotten. But the system he created survived. Because politicians understood something no gangster had grasped. That street violence can be bought. That the crowd's anger can be converted into votes. That gangs don't have to die, you just have to legitimize them. And so New York entered a new era. An era where the line between politician and criminal became so thin that nobody knew anymore who really ruled. Because in this city, it didn't matter who held power. The Civil War, North versus South, freedom versus slavery. That's what they said in newspapers, in churches, in Lincoln's speeches. But we saw something different. We saw that once again, we'd pay. The beginning of 1863, Congress introduced a draft to the Union Army. Every man between 20 and 35 could be called up, a lottery. But the law hid one provision. If you have $300, you can buy your way out. or pay someone to go for you. $300, a laborer's annual salary. The rich bought themselves out. The poor went to die. And there was something else. Something nobody talked about loudly. Lincoln proclaimed the abolition of slavery. Slaves from the South would be free. And we, Irish workers, thought only one thing. What if those free people come here? They'll work for even less than us. They'll take everything from us. Racism, yes. Fear, even greater. Because we were at the bottom and feared someone would push us even lower. On July 13th, the draft lottery began. Already in the morning, a crowd gathered outside the recruitment office. Irish, Germans, poor white workers. They shouted, "This isn't our war. Why should we die for blacks?" Someone threw a stone, broke a window. Someone else set the door on fire. Within half an hour, the building was burning, and hell began. Riots engulfed the entire city. Thousands of people in the streets. Rage that had been building for years poured out like lava. They attacked everything associated with authority. Police stations, government offices, homes of wealthy Republicans. But the worst was yet to come, because the mob found a new target. Black people. This wasn't revenge. This was a pogrom. People were dragged from streetcars, from streets, from homes. Beaten, lynched, hanged, their homes burned, their workplaces destroyed. I saw on Clarkson Street the mob catch a black porter. They beat him, hanged him from a tree, and then set him on fire. They sang. They danced around his body. I didn't help him. I didn't move. I watched. And to this day, I can't forgive myself. The worst happened on Fifth Avenue. Colored Orphan Asylum, an orphanage for black children. 200 children from 2 to 12 years old. The mob broke in the morning. Teachers and nurses managed to push the children out the back exit. Miraculously, all survived. But they burned the building completely. They looted what they could. Books, furniture, toys. It's hard to believe that dozens of people surrounded these children and shouted, "Kill these monkeys," wrote Harper's Weekly later. If not for the courage of a few citizens, many wouldn't have seen morning. But many adult blacks weren't so lucky. The riots lasted 4 days. Police tried to intervene, but 800 officers against thousands of enraged people was a drop in the ocean. They fought bravely, but were losing. The mob attacked from roofs, from windows, from doorways. Bricks, stones, bottles. One officer took a hit to the head, fell. Before colleagues could pull him out, he was trampled. The state militia was too weak. The city government begged for help. Only on July 16th did federal troops reach New York, soldiers fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg. They marched through streets in full gear with bayonets ready. The mob thought they were bluffing. They threw stones. Soldiers responded with fire, not into the air, into people. They fell by the dozens. On some streets, they defended behind barricades, but the army had cannons. Grape shot swept entire intersections. After a few hours, only echoes remained. By evening, the city was dead, silent as after a plague. In alleys lay bodies. Wagons with wounded rode over cobblestones, and on their backs sat women with children who cried, not knowing who they'd already lost. Officially, 119 killed. Unofficially, maybe 300, maybe 500. Nobody counted the black victims. Nobody wanted to count. After everything, the black community fled Manhattan. Thousands of people, in wagons, on foot, with what they could carry. They fled to Brooklyn, to Staten Island, to New Jersey. They didn't return for years. Some never did. And us, the Irish, we became a symbol of shame. The press drew us as wild apes with torches. Thomas Nast published caricatures that hurt more than blows, and they were right. That week, we were monsters, but also desperate people. Because how do you judge it? People who survived hunger, who lost families, who survived the ocean to be mocked every day. And now we're told to die in a war they didn't understand, for people they didn't know. This isn't justification, it's only explanation. Bad deeds don't become good when you understand why they happened. But maybe understanding is the first step toward ensuring they don't repeat. After the riots, the military stayed in the city. They imposed martial law. The draft resumed, but more gently. The city began paying for substitutions for those who couldn't afford to buy themselves out. Gradually, calm returned. Gangs fell apart. The new police were stronger. The Dead Rabbits era ended without fanfare, without blood, without a final battle. They just vanished. Other gangs replaced them, other names, other violence. Over time, they began tearing down 5 Points. In its place arose parks, new tenements, new streets. People said it was progress. But for us, it was like erasing an entire generation. Because in that hell they called the City of Freedom remained something nobody wanted to remember anymore. Not gangs, not violence, just people who still believed that even as the world crumbled, they still mattered. The 70s. New York is changing. 5 Points is dying. Not because poverty disappeared. Poverty never disappears. It's dying because the city expands like an organism shedding dead skin. New neighborhoods, new factories, new possibilities. Gangs change too. Dead Rabbits are already a memory. Bowery Boys, a legend spoken of in saloons, with a smile and disbelief. But others took their place. Wyos, 5 Points Gang. Eastmans, a new generation of the city that grew up in the shadow of their fathers. Wyos appeared in the late 60s. The name came from a whistle, Wyo, by which they recognized each other on the street. They didn't fight for honor, only for profit. They controlled prostitution, gambling, extortion. They even had a price list for services, real, printed on papers, and distributed to clients. Beating, $2. Serious beating, $10. Broken leg, $15. Shot in the leg, $25. Removing a problem permanently, $100. This was no longer chaos. This was business. Professional, cold, calculated. Then came them, 5 Points Gang, at the turn of the century. This was no longer a band of drunk boys from Irish slums. This was an organization, a criminal corporation with lawyers, accountants, bodyguards, and politicians in their pocket. They controlled illegal trade, alcohol, protection rackets. Their ranks filled with young immigrants, Italians, Jews, Sicilians. From these streets emerged people the whole world would hear about. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky. They started as errand boys, messengers, doing dirty work in 5 Points basements. Later, they built empires. But that's another era, the era of prohibition, federal agents, and machine guns. My era ended earlier, along with Dead Rabbits. At the end of the 19th century, the city began cleaning up after us. They tore down the most destroyed tenements, built new ones, still poor but no longer deadly. Reformers like Jacob Riis took photographs of slums and showed them in newspapers. How the Other Half Lives, his book was called. For the first time, the rich saw what conditions the poor really lived in. In place of the Irish came new arrivals. Italians, Jews from Eastern Europe, Chinese. Each had their neighborhood, their hopes, and their hell. And the Irish slowly rose to the surface, from basements to apartments, from misery to poverty, from poverty to working class. My neighbor's son became a policeman. A policeman! An Irish Catholic in a blue uniform, unthinkable 30 years earlier. Now half of New York police are Irish. Another acquaintance became a fireman, not a gang volunteer, but a real city service officer. A cousin's daughter went to school, a real school where children learn to read, write, count. Life began to have rhythm. I returned to 5 Points once, 1904. I hadn't lived there in years, but I had to see. Paradise Square looked different. Still poor, but not so dirty, not so deadly. Children ran through the street, laughed, played. They didn't steal. They didn't fight. They were just children. I stood at the corner where 30 years earlier, dead rabbits fought Bowery boys. Where the cobblestones were once red with blood. Now stood a cart with sausages. The vendor shouted in Italian, and I thought, maybe it was worth it after all. I sit now in a small apartment in Upper Manhattan. 3 rooms, windows facing a real street, not a courtyard reeking of sewage. I have work, legal, paid, honest, not prosperous, but my own. I have citizenship, real documents, not forged papers from the docks. I have a future. Thousands of people died before I got here. In hunger, on ships, in riots, in the streets. We survived hell and inflicted hell on others. We were victims, and we were executioners. But we survived. The Irish in New York, this isn't a fairy tale about poor, good immigrants. This is the story of people who fought for every bite of bread and every foot of cobblestone. They fought dirty, often wrong, but they fought. New York rose from the mud of 5 Points. From sweat, blood, and bricks. From millions of hands nobody will remember. You see those skyscrapers in Manhattan? Those colossi of concrete and steel? Who built them? Irish, Italians, Jews, and Poles. Nobody wrote their names in chronicles. Though they died falling from heights nobody had known before. They built the subway, breathing dust and grit. They unloaded ships, working 12 hours a day. They, like us Irish, transformed misery into brick, and brick into a city. This is our city. Not because someone gave it to us, because nobody gave anything, because we took it. I'm no longer a member of Dead Rabbits. That gang hasn't existed for a long time. I'm not that frightened boy who stepped off the boat in '48. I'm no longer just Irish. I'm a New Yorker. And that means I survived everything this city can throw at a person. And I'm still here. My grandson was born in a hospital in Harlem. He's an American by birth. He doesn't know Irish. He doesn't remember the hunger. He doesn't know how fear of a mob tastes. And good. Let him not know. Let him live in the city we built so he wouldn't have to fight for it. That was our gift to them, bought with blood, sweat, and years of humiliation. Were the gangs of New York heroes? Number. Were they monsters? Sometimes. Were they people? Always. People who had no choice, or thought they didn't. History isn't black and white. It's gray like the mud in 5 Points, like smoke over Paradise Square, like cobblestones after rain when blood washes into the gutters. New York was never clean, but it was alive. And that's how it was meant to be. A city that hates immigrants, and a city built by immigrants. When I die, I want to be buried in Queens, in an Irish cemetery, in the shade of birches and old graves. Not in Ireland. Here. Because this is my home. Not the one where I was born, the one I fought for. This was the story of the gangs of New York, but also about how a city was born. How people who had nothing created something that will last for centuries. If you made it this far, it means you love stories that stay in your head for a long time. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most. Was it how New York really looked once? If you liked what you just heard, leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell, because that way YouTube won't lose the next journey through time. Historical sources from the 19th century. The narrator is a fictional character, but his experiences are based on authentic accounts of Irish immigrants of this period. The goal of this narrative is to show history not as dry facts, but as the living experiences of people who went through them. With all the dirt, violence, and moral complexity of those times. Because history isn't just dates and names, it's people, with their fears, hopes, sins, and dreams. And that's a story worth telling. See you in the next episode.